Tons of stories and interests in what's going on with the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and allegations that he took luxury trips out of bounds of ethics for justices. And you're seeing a lot of media reports and activists wanting to essentially have this be a huge issue, including U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who is putting out statements about all of this, talking about how you've got the courts being impugned by Justice Thomas and his actions, alleged actions. Here's a statement from U.S. Senator Dick Durbin. The highest court in the land shouldn't have the lowest ethical standards. A ProPublica report reveals that Justice Thomas has for years accepted luxury travel on private yachts and jets and a litany of other gifts that he failed to disclose. This behavior is simply inconsistent with the ethical standards the American people expect of any public servant, let alone a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. And goes on to further say that the report demonstrates yet again the Supreme Court justices must be held to an enforceable code of conduct, just like every other federal judge. The ProPublica report is a call to action, and the Senate Judiciary Committee will act. So Durbin's laying out that he will be investigating this as the lead of the Senate Judiciary Committee. But looking more at that report, which of course looks to try to diminish Justice Thomas and possibly have him impeached or something. This of course is after a 6-3 conservative majority U.S. Supreme Court impacted Roe v. Wade, putting the issue of abortion back into the hands of states rather than just looking at previous court rulings from decades ago. But also the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which is the court case that recognized a constitutional right to carry firearms in public for self-defense. So a lot of critics of left-leaning organizations and activists say that those are the reasons why they're going after Clarence Thomas as hard as they are. But we have our own issues of judicial ethics being raised in Illinois when it comes to the Illinois Supreme Court. And if you recall, we had the questions of $1 million donations going to two Supreme Court justice candidates in Illinois from Governor J.B. Pritzker, who is also a lead defendant in the challenge against Illinois' gun ban, but was also a lead defendant in the challenge against Illinois' no cash bail law. Well, I talked with an individual that we're just going to call Jim. And Jim, he raised substantial questions about this, and he didn't really want to be identified because he's had certain threats, he says, against him for raising other types of questions. But Jim, he shared with us some of his thoughts about all of this, about the conflicts of interest that have been alleged, from the campaign donations to how you've got the U.S. Supreme Court as somewhat of a comparison of this. And if you're going to have ethics investigations there, then you have to have ethics investigations in Illinois. And he also reviews some of what the motion from the Calkins case in front of the Illinois Supreme Court to have these two justices, Elizabeth Rochford and Mary O'Brien, recuse themselves or be kept from taking part in the case. He reviews some of that. So here's Jim. We're just going to call him Jim based off his concerns of being identified. But he talks about Durbin's approach and how there needs to be focus on Illinois as well.
Well, right now, this is Senator Durbin's in case of emergency break glass. He must be aware of what's going on here in Illinois, and he's trying to make smoke and mirrors of Justice Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court when he's got a problem, a big problem, in our own backyard. Look, we should be outraged. In the country of Israel, they're trying to undermine the power of the judiciary over there, like what's happened here. They're protesting in the streets, where we sit here like Sean you and do nothing and take it as the way of things. We hold our constitutional rights close as what a child, a dead puppy, and speaks to it as though it were alive.
It's some pretty powerful imagery there, and Jim talks about the problem we have in Illinois as raised by the news reports and the political contributions that Pritzker gave to certain Supreme Court justice candidates.
Well, we have a constitutional crisis in that justices of the Illinois Supreme Court received prodigious campaign contributions from Governor Pritzker to advance his agenda relating to the Assault Weapons Ban and the Safety Act.
And even more, Jim talks about the motion from Calkins' attorney to have Rochford and O'Brien recuse themselves from hearing the gun ban challenge mid-May. And Jim says he reviewed it, and it leaves a little bit more to be desired.
No, actually, I have a copy of the motion for recusal disqualification filed by Gerald Stuck. And he did a very good job, but he left the ribbon off the package. He's only seeking recusal of Justices O'Brien and Rochford, but he should be asking the entire Illinois Supreme Court to recuse themselves in this instance because they've accepted the case, they've agreed to hear it, they did that collectively. It's not enough for one justice to sit there and say, I took no part. They're behind the scenes. It's a round table. We're not allowed to understand that. And moreover, there's a United States Supreme Court opinion on point that based on this level of conflict, they all have to recuse themselves. In other words, the Illinois Supreme Court can't hear this or anything else relating to J. Robert Pritzker, not JB or Jabba, as I'm fond of calling him. And I would suggest that Kwame Raoul also received $1 million, and he's pushing the agenda as well.
We'll hear more from Jim and his concerns about the recusal motion, but also what he thinks needs to happen, and even delve into a report that was filed to the Judicial Inquiry Board. And if you're not familiar with the Judicial Inquiry Board, it's a board that essentially allows for investigations into judicial ethics. So stay tuned. We'll get to that coming up next on WMAY.
This is something that the right wing is trying to stir up. I know you've written about it. The fact of the matter is I supported candidates who are running all across the board. If you're suggesting that the fact that I gave money to, let's say, the Democratic Party or to the committees that supported candidates means that everybody who received any money has to recuse themselves from anything to do with the state of Illinois, that's ridiculous.
That's Governor J.B. Pritzker when I asked him early last month to explain his $1 million donations to 2 Supreme Court justice candidates and whether they should recuse themselves. He said that's ridiculous. But a lot of observers saying that's not the case. Even the independent observer out of Colorado we talked to weeks ago saying that any kind of question of impropriety is enough to lead to recusal. So what happens next in Illinois as we've got the gun ban that's going to go in front of the Illinois Supreme Court? I talked with an observer named Jim. He wanted to remain anonymous, but he talked about the motion from Dan Calkins' attorney for recusal. He said that's not enough. He actually wants to see all of the Supreme Court justices recuse themselves. But what should the next steps be? What should the motion be?
Yeah, if this was done correctly, and from my humble perspective, they should be seeking a stay in federal court based on the considerable conflict of interest and violation of the judicial canons of ethics. It's not to decide the state court case, but to hold a stay until those offending justices or those that are conflicted are off the bench. And there's precedence for this as well. Former Chief Justice Thomas of the Illinois Supreme Court manipulated the system. He dominated from top to bottom to obtain the largest defamation award in Illinois history over an opinion column against a small community newspaper, the Kane County Chronicle, and a lawsuit was filed against the entire Illinois Supreme Court for violating the defendant's constitutional rights. And, actually the case got solved, but settled, but it made the point that that's a proper remedy.
Now, we have this thing called the Judicial Inquiry Board. It's a board where complaints can be filed against justices or judges. Is that a proper venue for this? Jim's familiar with the Judicial Inquiry Board, and he shares some of his thoughts.
Not exactly. Governor Pritzker makes considerable appointments to that board. He holds sway over their budget. They are conflicted. Moreover, I would say that none of these regulatory agencies that are in place to oversee this of their own volition have picked this up. The JIB should have done something months ago when these millions of dollars were being given and received. The office of the Illinois Inspector General's office actually contacted me, and I said, hey, you need a complaint? Why don't you do this on your own? All of the attorneys involved in that have knowledge of this. Pritzker is a lawyer. Cromer-Raoul arguably is a lawyer. They should be turned into the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission. Nobody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, although we have safeguards in place.
Now, Jim says he's able to say these things disparagingly against the justices because he's not an attorney. A lot of attorneys out there will be guarded because it's not really the best move to criticize justices. But you do have that official motion filed to have these justices recuse themselves. Jim saying that's not enough. What about complaints filed to the Judicial Inquiry Board? Jim's familiar with one.
I received a copy of a complaint that was filed with the Judicial Inquiry Board against the entire Illinois Supreme Court. And that complaint is seeking that all the justices do not hear the case. It's seeking that the Judicial Inquiry Board engage. And moreover, I also, as I read it, it discusses that the Illinois Supreme Court, in many instances, doesn't sign their orders. The clerk enters orders, and we never know what justice is involved sometimes in signing those orders unless there's a full opinion of the court. So that was the gist of it, but the whole matter has been reported to the Judicial Inquiry Board, and I got to tell you, they should have engaged months ago on this one, and they knew where this was going to go, and they did nothing. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, to report.
So we'll be watching that space closely and bring you the latest there as well. Got to take a break. It's WMAY.
From the Fly SPI studio.